Ronald's eyes tracked the mass of damp spreading through the ceiling. The hanging lamps swayed to the war's rhythm. Dull, repetitive, irritating. It didn't work, and no one cared enough to fix it. He'd got used to it by now, in a way. The lazy squeak, while the radio on the shelf chirped some sort of folk music. Outside, the peddlers' cries were giving way to the whistling and wooing of prostitutes. It was almost comforting. Another glass came crashing down onto the counter, which was already strewn with them. Some standing, most toppled. The remains of the platoon's annual memorial party. A day dedicated to those who'd fallen in battle, always unsurprisingly devolving into a game of who can get hammered first. Speed was a crucial factor. He sat next to Aaron, who wasn't taking part in the contest. Aaron had just deprived a private of his drink, causing a series of grunts as a response, with the occasional banging. With every thump, the glasses rattled in complaint. Ronald sighed. Sweat trickled down his face, leaving behind that unbearable itch. A crappy little fan sitting on the bar was all they had. Forget the Kong. The heat was what he hated most about this place. Aaron threw him a hasty glance, then his head sank. "Sorry, Sergeant." He took hold of his glass.
"Come on, guys, let's give him a real one. Fallen, but never forgotten."
He put it down. Ronald took a sip of his lukewarm beer. He sat with his back against the counter, watching the specks of sunlight that still seeped through the blinds. Most of the men had left. They'd had their drinks, and the few that were sober enough afterwards paid their respects as well. Brothers in arms, the higher-ups loved calling them. Just a collection of gauzy shapes and murky faces. Except for one. There was one face Ronald remembered well. Probably always would. For most, it was a wife or a daughter. Son, maybe. Something pleasant. Hell, anything. Anything other than that smile. But no. Brandon's smile was carved into Ronald's mind. He wasn't smiling now. He'd been quiet all day, sitting on the far edge of the bar, gorging on his whiskey. Ronald signaled the bartender with a waggle of his fingertips. He came closer, a slight tremor in his movements. Understandable. No one liked the prospect of a bunch of big, burly oafs letting loose in his establishment, and it was a fair bet that the prospect of a whole army of them letting loose in his country didn't seem much more appealing. "Get them another round," Ronald whispered, slipping some folded dong bills into his palm. He got a confused look. Same as before.
"Is on the house, too?"
the bartender asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Ronald rolled his eyes. Brandon chuckled.
"Feeling generous, Ronnie?"
"Only get one chance a year to do this," Ronald said. Brandon rid his bottle of its last drops.
"Courtesy of our fallen heroes."
The bartender was about to pour some more into a glass when Brandon snatched another bottle from him. Aaron was frowning. He turned towards Ronald. "Sorry, Sergeant, but don't need to say that all the time." "Yeah, sorry. Okay, won't happen again, Sergeant. I meant Sergeant," Ronald said. "Apologize all you want. Almost makes me think I'm in the right." "You are," Aaron said. "Brass is wrong on this one." He looked at Brandon. "I don't care if he's getting the job done. Way he's doing it still ain't right, and they just let him do whatever the hell he wants." "Can't expect them to lock up their poster boy," Ronald said. "Didn't know that gave him a free pass to use civilians as bait. It ain't—" Brandon peered over at Aaron, who averted his gaze. "Look, all I wanted to say is maybe he's had enough to drink." "Don't worry about it." That didn't seem to satisfy him. Okay, it's just... Well, there's only so much you can do if he loses it. We're pretty much expecting you to keep him in line, you know? Better not make things any harder than they already are." Couldn't do that if I tried. Aaron was about to open his mouth again, instead settling for a solemn nod.
Might make this your new assignment, Sarge,
Brandon said.
You just keep providing the booze, I'll win the actual battles.
That he did. Wins all over the board since Brandon was made lieutenant. Some murmurs about unconventional methods were quickly stamped out. Ronald was the annoying fly the brass just couldn't seem to swat. He'd been letting them know about every one of Brandon's little incidents, from the first till the most recent. Thinking of it now, the first time seemed mild compared to his later deeds. They'd been traveling through an abandoned town. Mostly abandoned. A few inhabitants were still rummaging around their homes, scavenging for anything with some sort of value. The platoon had been bogged down by a minefield. Not a rare thing. They sprinkled them where you least expected any. Cheap way to take out a few dozen chumps. Not with Brandon around. He'd whistled at one of the townsfolk crawling through some garbage, told him there was a hidden stash of supplies in one of the buildings ahead. Having bought every single thing he was told, he started racing towards it, into the mines. Legs striding, arms flailing, his whole body seemed to drift loose, full of hope for a few seconds. Wasn't full of much after those seconds. He burst open, and all that hope splattered through the air, some of it oozing through the dirt in pulpy bits. By the end of that day, the platoon had reached its destination. A job well done, with no casualties. None that mattered, anyway. Ronald had tried getting to the villager, but Brandon hadn't let him. He held Ronald firm to the ground, with what was probably great ease. Ronald at least tried to force his way past. He tore at Brandon, yelling, spit, and all that. Had more effort in him back then. He was still fresh from eating up sermons about heroism. Brandon just stood with his back turned, outstretched arm ensuring that Ronald would not get a chance to disrupt his plan. After it was done, Ronald found himself staring at Brandon for a good long while. All he received in return was a smile. He was betting on more than that tonight. Brandon was returning some patrons' looks, and one after the other they backed down. Once they'd all settled for staring at either the floor or the ceiling, Brandon treated them to a lump of spit. It landed next to a group of them. That warranted a few grumbles, but still nothing major.
Not a fan of the slums?
Ronald asked. All he got was silence.
Want to choose a different bar next year?
Oh, God forbid there's fewer slopes in that one.
Thought you'd like it. Thought you loved having slopes around. Always find some use for them.
That got him a laugh.
Don't you?
That got him a stare. Aaron pulled at Ronald's sleeve, his voice trembling almost as much as his hand.
What are you?
Brandon groaned as he got up from his stool. He wobbled towards Ronald, towering over him. As he leaned in close, the stink of alcohol in his heavy breath wafted into Ronald's nostrils. You fishing for a confession, Ronnie? Brandon was smiling now. Admission of my, what did you call them? Detestable war crimes? Getting innocents killed in order to achieve my goals? His voice dropped to a hush. You know, even I've lost track of all my bullshit excuses. Combat conditions, collateral damage. They always fall for that one, right? He raised his tone again.
Poor souls tragically caught in the crossfire.
You really do get off on it, Ronald said.
You telling me you don't?
He tilted his head to the right. Not even a little? Ronald wasn't sure if Brandon was still toying with him or asking a serious question. He also wasn't sure which one of the two possibilities bothered him more. And the longer Brandon didn't talk, the more Ronald thought he was waiting for an answer. No, Aaron said. He's not sick like you.
Ouch! Sick? That's harsh. Brandon put a hand on Aaron's shoulder, who flinched back. Are you like him? Thinking you're gonna save all of them? He waved his arm across the room. If they don't want to chew their own leg off, they don't get to complain that someone's doing it for them. Was never gonna be pretty. It'll leave a few scratches. More than a few, Ronald said. Brandon shook his head. You can't see past your own whining anymore. Always go running to the captains, ready to rat. You ever think about what happens if we all had the same stick up our ass? We rot. Numbers drop. Your pals the Slopes here get some courage. They move back in, have their way with us. His smile was gone. If you think what I'm doing isn't pretty, wait until you see the alternative. Brandon started walking back to his stool, then stopped halfway. You've got to learn, Ronnie. You don't learn, you end up like every other miserable bastard that died over here. Just another number written off a list. If you're lucky, someone shouts out your name while getting wasted in some shithole. The bottle was back in his hand. Don't feel bad for any of these bastards giving you puppy eyes. They got themselves into this fucking mess. Now they try to get rid of the only help their sorry asses were lucky enough to ever... We don't want your help! A shout was heard. It was a younger man sitting at a table. Brandon's brow rose, followed by a giggle. The man persisted. You'll make everything worse! Brandon made his way to the table. He stopped before the man, who got to his feet, meeting Brandon's lazy eye with quite the glare. You come to our home, and you shoot people. You steal, and you don't respect anyone. You cannot help. You cannot do anything. And when you lose, you blame us, because you are useless, and you cannot... The bottle shattering on his face cut him off. He bent to the right, flopping down on the ground. Brandon kneeled over him, flipping the man's head upwards. He flicked a glass shard from his cheek, holding it between his fingers. He then started ramming his fist into the man's face, the shard ripping its way through. Ronald stood close, unmoving, like everyone else. Aaron was next to him, eyes darting back and forth. They settled on Ronald. Aren't you going to do something? He didn't get a response. Taking a deep breath, Aaron stepped forward, ready to lunge himself at Brandon. That's when Ronald stretched out his arm, blocking his path. He guessed it was surprise that made Aaron halt for a moment. Didn't take long for that surprise to turn into anger. He started all but clawing at Ronald to get through, shouting at him. None of it worked. Brandon was finished in less than a minute. He walked out, shouldering past people. Little remained of the man's face. Some of his limbs were twitching. He's done, Ronald said. Yeah, look at him, Aaron said. Why didn't you... Brandon, slaughtering an unarmed civilian, unprovoked, witnesses. Dishonorable discharge, at least. If this opens up a real investigation into everything else... That only made Aaron run his palm over his face. Ronald glanced over at the empty whiskey bottles. A few minutes later, he walked out of the bar, while Aaron found himself staring at Ronald for a good, long while.